Hello and welcome to the Nevin Economic Research Institute's video series. My name is Sarah Harte and I'm the president of the Irish Second Level Students' Union, and today I'm going to chat to the author of this new book, An Ireland Worth Working For, Tom Healy, about the content of his book and in particular its relevance to young people in Ireland today. So just to get things started, Tom, maybe one of the things that struck me from your book, I suppose, is the section on work, and it's something that is going to impact us all as we're going into the future. And one of the things that I found particularly interesting, as I suppose I'm in college myself now, I'll be graduating in 3 years, is the differences in the working world that we can expect for people of my generation in comparison to maybe when you first entered the workforce. Is that something that you thought about when you were writing this book? Or
Yes, in a way the book is dedicated to work and the future of work, because work is very much at the center of what we do, how we earn a living, but also how we find meaning and connection with other people. And it's important to say at the outset that work is more than paid work. It's all types of caring, of economic activity is much broader than just the labour market. Obviously, the labour market is very much the center of what we look at, and we are a trade union related think tank, so for us the labour market is a key part of what we look at. But in this book I was certainly trying to reflect on the challenges and risks of artificial intelligence, of demographic change, also the challenge to trade unions in terms of representing workers in the workplace, especially young people, where there is a big challenge to remain relevant, to adapt the way we present our message, to adapt indeed the strategy to tackle inequalities, precarious work. Inequality in pay is still a big issue for many young people entering the workforce. So there's a big challenge there. It's a very different labour market to what you had maybe 40 years ago. It's changing even since the beginning of the recession in 2008. We've seen big shifts in the composition and distribution of work in Ireland.
Okay, and just to, I suppose, pick up on one of the things that you touched on there, is how work is much more than paid employment. And one of the things that you highlighted in your book, you highlighted that very well in your book, and something I suppose that I picked up from that was how one of the maybe last great imbalances or injustices is the differences in between so the people who are participating in the work at home, and they're also, we see now how in the last couple of decades there's been a massive influx of women into the workforce, and how women are still doing as much work as they used to at home, and how I think that is one of the last great imbalances, that difference in emotional labour and care work. How do you think that impacts on the workforce when we have one gender doing the majority of this care work?
Yes, and it's true what you say, and it's probably more true of Ireland than other European countries, that there is an imbalance in the use of time, and that is reflected actually in time use survey data, which indicates that Ireland has a particular gender imbalance. I think reform of parental leave, greater work flexibility, I think also greater representation of women in, some people talk about the boardroom, I would say at every level of enterprise and decision making. All we have to do is look at the way, for example, our parliament works, our Oireachtas, the timing of meetings, the structure of work is not at all family friendly. It's much more than childcare. That's important, obviously, but there is certainly a culture that militates against equality, not just in the paid labour market, but in the broader society. And the idea that a prime minister would take a few months off to have a baby, such as in New Zealand, that will be quite an achievement in Ireland.
Okay, and I suppose moving on from that, sort of focusing on maybe the injustices at work, precarious work, something that I suppose has become more and more discussed and talked about and relevant, and is particularly relevant for people of my generation. What differences do you think there are in how precarious work is going to impact the work-life balance that people of my generation are going to have when they graduate and enter the workforce?
It depends very much on the sector, but the picture that is emerging, and a lot of research work has been done here in the NERI about precarious work by my colleagues Kieran Nugent and Lisa Wilson. And what they're showing is a very different pattern of precarious work. To some extent, people are hanging on. They perhaps don't quite realize, in some cases, what the nature of precariousness is. And a very important aspect of stability in earnings and income is actually income protection throughout the life cycle, from the beginning of work, after college or school, as the case may be, to the latter phase of life. And I think this actually is a big inequality issue, that young people entering the labour force in the private sector or in the public sector have much inferior pension rights than was the case in the past. And this isn't obvious now at the moment, but it will become obvious. Of course, we know that the pension age is going to be increased gradually, and the proportion of people in their late 50s, early 60s working in Ireland is higher than in many other European countries. And that's an interesting outcome, I think, because with changing demography, with changing age structure, we need to provide for equality of opportunity at all stages in the life cycle and in the labour market. I think precariousness is affecting people in what we used to call white-collar jobs, in areas that may be quite surprising, from media to accountancy to the legal profession. It's not just, but it is very much also prevalent in hospitality and retail and sectors such as that, where you've got a high proportion of young people and migrant workers as well, living very much or working very much from week to week, in some cases almost from hour to hour. But that is being addressed to some degree by recent legislation.
Okay, and you said there how people maybe don't have a full grasping of what precarious work is, or the nature of it, or how it impacts people. Do you want to maybe give us a bit of an insight into that, just so people are aware?
Sure. I mean, one example of that is the IT sector, where this would concern obviously a minority of young graduates, but there are plenty of jobs available now in the IT sector, particularly in the Dublin area, and it's very buoyant at the moment. Starting salaries are increasing. It's still a struggle for people to match that with housing costs, obviously, but it is very much dependent on the current stage of the economic cycle, and there is evidence of a scarring effect when people enter the labour market during a recession, such as in 2008, 2009, 10. It does emerge, the evidence does indicate that they are at a disadvantage for the rest of their lives, actually, which seems a rather gloomy outcome, but that actually emerges particularly from UK research. And we know that there is an economic cycle, that conditions change from sector to sector and for the economy as a whole. So this, I think, is something where perhaps right now at the moment a lot of young people are thinking, well, it's pretty good out there, and there are opportunities now in Ireland, and it's nothing like what it was, say, a decade ago maybe. But that could change, and it also can impact on particular sectors disproportionately. Could be retail, for example. Very often retail has unskilled workers, that's true, but that makes them all the more vulnerable to shocks in the economy, and there are lots of changes happening in the retail sector, and added to that, of course, is the uncertainty of Brexit.
Which will bring us very nicely along to what I would like to talk about next, and something that you a lot of time was spent on the book was Europe, and it's something that I found of particular interest, and I think the whole conversation about Europe and the future of Europe is something that is taking up more and more time on the airwaves, and even in people's minds. Obviously with Brexit, we can't help but see it and consume it every day. So something that you mentioned that I think it sort of brought to my own mindset was the darker side of EU membership. The how people have to ensure that European banks got repaid for their risky investments, and how it's now citizens who are paying the price for this. And I think it was only seeing it there that it sort of made me realise that maybe this isn't something that is public knowledge or in the public domain. How well do you think Irish people's knowledge of the EU and how it actually operates is? Do you think people fully grasp what it means?
Probably not. Knowledge is patchy, although I would imagine better than in other EU member states. And we know that there is much stronger support for EU membership in general and for membership of the Eurozone. And things have gone rather well economically since about 2013. Even still, the role of the EU institutions, including the European Central Bank, as you remarked there, was certainly not helpful in terms of the Irish response to the recession. I think our relationship with the EU is evolving. From, if you go right back to the beginning of our membership in 1972, there was overwhelming support to go into what was then the European Economic Community. Actually, at the time, the trade unions and the Irish Labour Party campaigned against membership of the European Economic Community. I was a school student at the time, and I was involved in campaigning against membership of the EEC in the referendum in May 1972. I changed my mind subsequently, but I think there has always been a healthy scepticism on the part of many trade unionists, and if I may say so, people on the political left, that the EU is not all that it's cracked up to be, that there are serious issues with some aspects of its economic policy and approach to social issues. Having said that, I think the recent experience, particularly around Brexit and the rise of far-right politics in Eastern Europe, really shows that the EU, for all its problems and all its shortcomings, is still a powerful, potentially powerful force for good on the European continent. The European Union is not Europe. Europe is over 500 million people, including Russia and many other countries. But nonetheless, the European Union is a collection of countries with shared values, with similar approaches to economic and social policy, some important differences obviously as well. And I think we need to reform it. We need also to be conscious of how an intergovernmental or a supranational body like the EU can make a crucial difference on climate change. In fact, we shouldn't be talking about climate change, but climate breakdown. And only at the international level can we effectively tackle those problems. So for those reasons, I think membership of the EU is a good thing, but we do need to be mindful of the need for radical change.
And when you speak about that radical change there, you talked about reform of the EU in your book and how a citizen-led movement was needed to sort of take back the democratic control of the EU. Do you think that there is the will amongst people to actually change the EU? Do you think that their view or their interest goes beyond their national parliament?
I think it's very difficult. I mean, there is an improvement compared to the past, but I think, to be honest, a lot of people still very much look at the EU as something that delivers to us, that protects us, that provides funding for agriculture, that provides certain protections in the labour market and certain rights if you go abroad to study or to avail of healthcare. So I think still there's a lot of, what do we get out of it? At the same time, with European elections coming up, for example, people are aware of much bigger issues. But, we're in the northwest corner of Europe. We haven't even seen what's happened down in the south and the southeast with the influx of migrants and the extraordinary positive outlook of Germany at the beginning of that particular crisis. That didn't hit the Irish media really to the same extent. But I think in the main, people are positively disposed to the EU. I think one practical way of increasing interest and attachment is to give every EU citizen a stake, a very tangible stake. And one example of that is the European insurance card, which I think you're supposed to have when you go on holidays or visiting people in the European Union. That's a tangible thing in your pocket, and it reminds you of certain entitlements and rights, which are important, by the way, obviously. If we could do the same thing for work and have a kind of European social insurance card that you carry around with you, and that reminds you that your member state, your country, is paying into a European social fund, and that gives you particular specific rights and entitlements no matter where you live or work in the European Union. In other words, you're moving towards a federal type social insurance model. Now, that would be very difficult to achieve because I could imagine all sorts of political objections to it, not least from Germany and France. But I think it's those kind of radical ideas that are necessary to literally save the European Union in the next 30 years. Otherwise, I think there is an opening there for people, for movements to frighten people and to say, well, you know, the EU isn't working and we've too many migrants, or it's just not compatible with national sovereignty. That kind of thinking can get embedded in a society where there is a disconnect between the citizen and the EU. So that's something we need to actually address here in Ireland.
And when you talk about that opening where I suppose the far right has started to fill and seems to be relevant for a lot of people, we haven't seen that same rise to the same extent in Ireland, but obviously we're not immune from it either. Would you perceive the rise of the far right to be a real and current threat in Ireland?
Well, in the book, I almost dismissed it. I've taken the view that there is limited political support for far-right politics. Now, we need to be careful in defining what exactly we're talking about here. But I do sense that, in fact, there is potential there for people to start raising issues, particularly around immigration. And I think the danger, of course, is that it runs off in a particular direction politically. But so far, we have nothing like, well, almost every other EU member state, including Finland and Germany and Hungary and Poland and Britain and Spain, Italy, have, you know, quite right-wing political parties that are Eurosceptic, that are complaining about migration and that are raising all of these issues. We don't have that in Ireland, and it's difficult to see really any serious basis for that, at least at the moment. But that doesn't mean that it couldn't happen, because things can change. And we should also remember, of course, that this book is about Ireland, north and south, and we need to be mindful as well of the potential for sectarian violence and for disaffected young people in particular in parts of Northern Ireland to become swayed again by particular political movements. I think it was interesting in Derry at a launch we had there last week of the book. Someone pointed out, and I hadn't actually thought about this, the person said, an Ireland worth working for, not fighting for. And I think that's an important point, actually, that we need to work for a different Ireland, and that means actually putting in place the economic and social conditions, especially for young people, so that some of these risks that you mentioned are not going to deliver negative outcomes.
And obviously we were talking about different risks there around young people in the working world, but I suppose obviously the greatest risk of all is climate change, or what did you say, climate breakdown. More evidently, and all of these, everything else that we have discussed is basically irrelevant if we don't have a place to live in 100 years. So I suppose moving on to that, you said how changing attitudes and policy was both a long-term but an urgent need. And I sort of found that phrase interesting because it's nearly a bit of a paradox that something could be both long-term and urgent. Would you mind explaining that to listeners there?
The science indicates that we have limited time, very limited time, to actually do what is necessary to control and bring down the increase in global temperatures. We're not talking even about reducing temperatures, but just to control,
to contain it.
To contain it. We have very limited time over the next decade approximately. Now, Ireland is a small player in terms of global greenhouse gas emissions, but per capita we are very high actually. We're one of the highest emitters, in fact, of greenhouse gas. Part of that is to do with agriculture, which is a difficult topic because many people depend on it for their employment and livelihoods. Part of it is to do with transport. We have this also this bloated car-dependent culture, and that's partly to do with the lack of adequate public transport infrastructure. Part of it as well is to do with high carbon industrial activity, and that manifests itself in some particular industries. Paradoxically, the downturn in construction in 2009 actually helped our pollution targets. Now, that wasn't a good thing that construction collapsed because we need more homes for people, but clearly we were building the wrong types of property in the wrong places. That's another story. But the climate environmental implications of that are huge. I think difficult choices are needed in switching to renewable energy. Also in terms of switching behaviour of people towards other types of energy, towards public transport, towards more efficient home heating. And all of that will call for changes in taxation, but also on the positive side in the supply of alternatives for people. There's no point in saying to someone in County Offaly or in County Mayo, they shouldn't be using a car. I mean, the reality is that they need it to get to work.
I know myself. I live in the countryside, and without a car, we don't go anywhere.
Yes. So again, it's a long-term challenge, as you said, but urgent action is needed right now, and that includes also investing in renewable energy to replace some of those fossil fuel elements of energy production in Ireland, coal and peat. There are alternatives. There are other ways in which workers in those industries can be employed. It requires much adjustment in terms of skills, but also creating new jobs and opportunities in areas such as solar and wind power, for example, possibly biomass as well, and carbon capture.
And do you think that there is the realization now amongst politicians and decision makers that they are going to have to make decisions now that may not benefit them in the short term? And how do we start to get decision makers and politicians to take a long-term approach to things when they mightn't necessarily reap the benefits?
Yes, well, it's a very good question because the electoral cycle, which is rather short, tends to drive everything.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, I think it would be accurate to say that with a few exceptions, everyone across the political spectrum agrees, oh yes, we must do something about the environment. But actually, when you spell it out and say, well, okay, do you double and treble the cost of diesel? Oh no, we couldn't possibly do that. Do you double the cost of home heating, fuel, oil and coal, for example? That would affect hundreds of thousands of households in rural areas especially that wouldn't be on any gas grid or not yet availing of solar energy, for example. So these are tough choices. I think what's needed is a national plan that actually sets out really ambitious goals every 5 years. Now, there are plans, of course. There are plenty of plans, government plans, over the last few years. But the reality is that we're probably going to be fined a lot of money in 2020 because of non-compliance with EU guidelines on these areas. So I think from a citizen's point of view, this needs to be front and foremost in political debate. People need to be held to account. People need to be confronted with difficult choices. And there are legitimate questions about carbon taxes from some people who are very pro-environment. They argue that corporations should pay more. I am personally sympathetic to that view, but I think we need to do a lot more work to spell that out and to say, well, how would corporations pay more for carbon emissions, either in production or in consumption? That needs to be really concretized. But it is true that carbon taxes on their own will not solve the problem, and if done in the wrong way, could actually penalise and impoverish many households.
Okay, and I suppose we touched there on the impact of decision makers and sort of how connected the electorate are to those decisions, and that sort of brings me on to the next topic that I wanted to discuss, which was the access to power and decision making that regular people have. And I think you drew a very important distinction in your book between the difference of equality of access and opportunity to access. Do you want to maybe explain to people what the difference is there?
Yes, I think equality, again, is one of those terms that everyone will say it's great. Of course, we're for equality, liberty and fraternity, to quote the slogan of the French Revolution. And it's embedded in the first democratic programme, which is very much the starting point, in fact, of the book, because this year is the centenary of the first democratic programme. But what does equality really mean, particularly for people who are on the margins of society, who are powerless, who are also living in economic precarity? And the reality is that people have different levels of access to power in the media, in the world of politics, in the world of social commentary. Some people have access to networks, to social networks that other people don't have. And it seems to me that even from early childhood onwards, people are already being sorted into different social groups, have different contacts, different points of access to power and to influence. It's interesting, I think, in a school context, for example, how the head pupil, there's a process for selecting the head pupil, and already people are being conditioned into a certain hierarchical way of thinking, and also a whole reality of preferment, that certain people know, if I behave in this way, if I say the following things, if I speak in a certain way, if I adhere to a certain set of ideas. I see this very much in the area of economics, because I'm familiar with the profession of economics from many years past. You get kudos for doing certain types of research, for making it very mathematical, very almost inaccessible to ordinary people, by, in a certain sense, accepting certain assumptions about the way the world is, the way markets work, and human rationality. And it's deeply ideological, deeply, in fact, biased in terms of social and class interest, and yet it's dressed up as a neutral science, and economists are given this kind of reverence. I give that as an example of unequal access to power, because if a group of economists meet in the middle of an economic crisis, immediately the media is down with their TVs and cameras and everything else to get expert economic advice on what's happening and what needs to be done. And the reports say that economists say that we need wage moderation. Economists say that we need to cut back on public expenditure. And we had this for a number of years, especially during the recent economic crisis. but other voices were submerged. In particular, the voices of young people coming into the labour market were not listened to, and decisions were made by people, who would not suffer necessarily the consequences of some of these decisions. It applied to welfare. It applied to wages as well. And the legacy of that, I think, is intergenerational inequality, which may not be so obvious now, but will be more obvious in the future.
That's very good. And I think when you touched on there about the impact that has on young people, I think all you need to do is look at the Leaving Cert. And when you're discussing the differences between equality of access and equality of opportunity, that everyone has the access to the Leaving Cert. Of course, education is free, but how they experience that could be very different. Obviously, we have I know all too well myself, as my work with the second level students union, the rise of grind schools and how parents can obviously pay to give their children the edge in the Leaving Cert.
Absolutely.
Do you see any way of levelling that playing field?
Well, education is obviously riven with social inequalities, perhaps not as much or as badly as health. I mean, if we ran the education system like we run the health system in this country, we would have completely private fee-paying schools for half the population, literally. So there is some limited measure of equality in the education system. For all its faults, the Leaving Cert is a blunt instrument. But you're quite right, Sarah. It's what I would call the cultural capital, to use a fancy word, in the home, that the young person is already has a head start even before they get to school at the age of 4 or 5. And then that difference is augmented over time. I think effective investment in early childhood care and education is part of the answer to educational inequality. But also, I think investment in special supports particularly for pupils and students with special needs, that can cover a very wide spectrum. I think we're not picking up a lot of these challenges and issues early enough, and then the effects of it are becoming very obvious then when people reach the end of secondary and people either drop out in many cases or would not go on to further or higher education.
I think what you touched on there, the intergenerational inequality, and how you can see those differences from an early age can be best seen in the differences of vocabulary of a 3-year-old. I saw studies there that they do how the part where you live if you live in a certain part of Dublin or another, how that can already have such an impact from such an early stage. What do you think is the best way of combating that when so much of what a child learns is learned through their home? Do you think that school is the best place to equalise that?
School is part of the answer, and also early preschool, early childhood. But actually, it's the family relationship that is quite crucial, and empirical research would confirm that the influence of family is more significant actually in determining educational outcomes. Schools are important, and we need to take educational school equality issues very seriously, more seriously perhaps than we do. But the role of the family is important, and that also, I'll give a very specific example. Reading actually there is powerful evidence that mothers and fathers reading to their children makes a big difference in the first 3 to 4 years of life. And that is a very noticeable difference across the social divide in Ireland. You can go into a home where there are basically no books in the home. And that, again, it has a real impact on people when they go to school in terms of homework, in terms of parental confidence as well in helping children and talking to teachers on the part of parents. So there are things there that need to be done at the community level. Obviously, schools and public agencies have a role in raising awareness. I think as a society we need to take a leaf from the Scandinavian countries, where they put a lot of emphasis actually on, they have a very different approach to schooling and learning in the early years. They begin formal schooling in reading and writing and mathematics much later than we do. And yet they have the best outcomes at the age of 16. Their approach is actually a much more open, a much more relaxed, much less pressurized experience for children, particularly between the ages of 3 and 6. That would be typical in Sweden, in Finland, for example. And then throughout their primary education level, they're much more focused on the child actually, and much less emphasis on scoring and league tabling, which is something of an obsession in some of the English-speaking countries. We're not quite that bad here, but...
So thank you very much, Tom, for joining me today for what was an interesting and insightful discussion. I actually learned a lot from your book, and I think it was very accessible, actually. It sort of brought economics into a way that you didn't necessarily need to be an economist to understand, which I think is really important and something that there's probably a bit of a gap in already. So here's the book, and Ireland's Worth Working For, and you'll be able to find out where to buy it in the box below. But thank you very much for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.